He pushed the front door open and whispered, "Hello, Aisha." But the house answered with a silence so perfect it felt like a warning. Earlier that day, everything in Daniel's life had slid off the rails. The missed alarm, the coffee stain on his only clean shirt, the packed train. Then the presentation he'd spent weeks preparing flattened into awkward pauses and polite, empty smiles. His boss didn't yell. She did something worse. She sent him home with pity in her eyes. Now, standing in his spotless hallway on a weekday afternoon, Daniel's shame sharpened into fear. 3 little kids don't make a home this quiet. Unless something is wrong. A soft murmur drifted from the twins' room, steady, warm, almost like water over stones. Daniel edged to the door and peeked through the crack. On the rug sat Aisha, their black Maid legs tucked to the side like she'd been there forever. His 2-year-old daughter slept in her lap, thumb in her mouth, safe under Aisha's chin. The 4-year-old twins leaned into Aisha's shoulders, still as lanterns, and in Aisha's hands was an old book of poems from her homeland, her voice turning unfamiliar words into a lullaby. One twin traced the air with his finger, copying the shapes of letters he couldn't read, yet somehow understood. Daniel stepped back, throat tight. He'd come home looking for someone to blame. Instead, he'd found peace built deliberately, patiently by a woman he'd underestimated. That night, he didn't write a speech. He brewed tea the way Aisha did, set the poetry book beside her favorite cup, and left a note for the next quiet afternoon. By morning, the book was gone. But on the windowsill sat a small rosemary plant, and the same scrap of paper flipped over, "Thank you." And Daniel realized something had changed quietly for good. The silence hit Daniel before the door even closed behind him. Not the peaceful kind, but the wrong kind. The kind that presses against your ears and makes your heart start filling in the blanks with fear. A house with 3 small children was never supposed to sound like this. No cartoons murmuring, no footsteps racing down the hall, no small voices arguing over nothing at all, just stillness. Daniel stood there with his briefcase slipping from his hand, listening. His failure from the office still clung to him, but now a sharper panic cut through it. Where are they? His mind reached for headlines he wished he didn't remember. He moved carefully, as if noise itself might shatter something fragile. The living room was immaculate, too immaculate. Toys, neatly stacked cushions, perfectly placed. It felt staged, like a picture pretending to be a home. He whispered their names, barely trusting his own voice. No answer. The silence swallowed it whole. Then he heard it, a sound so soft it almost wasn't there. Not a cry, not laughter. A low, rhythmic murmur drifting from down the hall. Human, but gentle, steady. It pulled him forward despite the knot in his stomach. The twins' bedroom door was slightly open, a ribbon of warm afternoon light spilling onto the floor. Daniel stopped just short of the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. This was the moment he thought the truth he hadn't planned to see. The reason the house felt so unnaturally calm. His pulse thudded in his ears as he leaned closer, and everything inside him shifted. What he saw wasn't neglect. It wasn't carelessness. It was something far more unsettling in its beauty. Aisha sat on the rug like she belonged to the light itself. The children gathered around her in quiet trust. The chaos he'd braced for never came. Instead, peace filled the room, thick, intentional, alive. Daniel felt the fear drain out of him, replaced by something heavier. Recognition. The kind that doesn't accuse loudly, but stays. The kind that asks without words. When was the last time you made room for this? He stepped back slowly, as if even breathing too hard might disturb what he'd almost misunderstood, and almost missed. Daniel didn't move. He forgot how. Time seemed to thin inside that doorway, stretching the moment until it felt fragile like glass. Aisha sat in the center of the room, not posed, not performing, just there. Their youngest slept deeply in her lap, mouth slightly open, breath slow and trusting. One small hand clutched the fabric of Aisha's dress, as if even sleep didn't want to let go. The twins leaned into her sides, their bodies slack with a calm Daniel hadn't seen in months. No restless legs, no whispered arguments, just stillness. Aisha's voice moved through the room like a lullaby remembered from another life. The words were foreign to Daniel, but the meaning wasn't. Her tone rose and fell gently, carrying the rhythm of poetry older than the house itself. One twin followed her finger as it traced the lines on the page, his own finger floating in the air, copying the shape of letters he couldn't read but somehow understood. Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. This wasn't supervision. This wasn't a trick to keep children quiet. This was presence, full, unhurried, generous presence, the kind that didn't rush toward the next task or glance at the clock, the kind Daniel realized with a slow, sinking ache he had stopped offering without ever meaning to. He had measured fatherhood in groceries, bought bills paid, hours worked. He had mistaken exhaustion for effort, noise control for care. And here on a soft rug in the afternoon light, Aisha was giving his children something he hadn't known how to name until now: safety without conditions. Shame rose in him, but it wasn't sharp. It was heavy. Honest. He had come home ready to accuse, to unload the failure of his day onto the nearest flaw he could find. Instead, he had stumbled into a moment so tender it demanded silence. Daniel stepped back, heart pounding, afraid that even gratitude might be too loud. He understood then this was not something to interrupt or claim. It was something to learn from. And as he retreated down the hallway, one thought followed him, steady and undeniable. This is what love looks like when no one is watching. Daniel sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The anger he'd carried home from the office had nowhere to go now. It had dissolved the moment he saw that room not into relief, but into something far more uncomfortable. Recognition. He had walked through the door looking for a mistake, for something or someone to blame, for the way his life felt like it was slipping out of rhythm. He wanted proof that the chaos in his head had an external cause. And instead he had found quiet competence care so deep it made his own absence impossible to ignore. He thought of all the nights he'd come home late, loosened his tie, kissed foreheads, half distracted while screens flickered in the background. He thought of how often he'd mistaken being tired for being present. How easily he'd accepted noise as normal and calm, as something you had to pay for outsourced schedule. What he'd just witnessed shattered that excuse. Aisha hadn't silenced his children. She hadn't managed them. She had met them at eye level at their pace inside their small, busy hearts, and given them something he hadn't realized they were starving for. And the most painful part wasn't that she could do it. It was that he could have too. Daniel felt shame settle in his chest, slow and heavy, but it didn't crush him. It clarified. It showed him the truth he'd been avoiding. He hadn't been failing because he was incapable. He'd been failing because he was distracted, rushing past the very moments that mattered, telling himself he'd show up later. Later had been stealing from him quietly. He sat there for a long time, letting the house breathe around him. The silence no longer felt accusing. It felt earned. Built carefully, minute by minute, by someone who understood that children don't need constant entertainment. They need someone willing to slow down enough to truly see them. Daniel stood up at last, not with answers but with resolve. He would not break that moment. He would not turn it into an interrogation or a compliment spoken too loudly. He would honor it the only way that mattered, by changing what he did next. Daniel rose quietly, every movement deliberate, as if the air itself could tattle on him. He knew with a certainty that surprised him what he could not do. He could not step into that room. He could not clear his throat or whisper an apology, or let gratitude spill out clumsily and fracture what Aisha had built so carefully. To be seen in that moment would turn something pure into performance. It would make her self-conscious. It would pull the children out of the peace they hadn't even realized they were holding. So instead, Daniel walked back to the front door. He opened it wide, then closed it firmly, loud enough to echo through the hallway, loud enough to announce a return that had never happened. "Hello?" he called, pitching his voice into the familiar, tired rhythm of a man coming home from work. "Anyone here?" He waited, counting his breaths. Footsteps came softly from down the hall. Aisha appeared composed as always, hands folded loosely in front of her. Her cheeks were warm, as if she'd been sitting in sunlight. Nothing in her face asked to be praised. Nothing asked to be explained. "Oh, sir," she said gently. "You're home early." "Yeah," Daniel replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Slow day." The lie slipped out easily, almost mercifully. He gestured toward the quiet house. "Everything okay? It's peaceful." "Yes," she said with a small nod. "The little one fell asleep. The twins are resting. We had some quiet time." Quiet time? The words landed differently now. They were no longer a vague phrase from an interview. They were a doorway he'd just looked through and would never see the same way again. "That's great," he said, and felt his throat tighten. "Really great. I'll just change. Don't let me interrupt." As he passed the twins' room, the door stood open wider now. The boys sat on the floor, stacking blocks with unhurried focus. They looked up. "Hi, Dad," one whispered. Daniel nodded back, heart full and aching. He walked on without another word, carrying the secret with him, not as a burden, but as a promise. Some things he understood now are honored best by being left intact. That night, when the house finally settled into its familiar evening noise and then softened into sleep, Daniel found himself standing alone in the living room. The shelves were dim in the low light shadows, stretching across spines he'd passed 1,000 times without really seeing. His hand stopped on the dark, worn book of poems. He lifted it gently, surprised by its warmth, as if it still held the afternoon inside it. The pages were soft at the edges, marked by use, by love. He couldn't read a single word, but somehow that felt right. Meaning didn't always require translation. A thank you spoken aloud felt wrong. Too loud. Too clumsy. It would turn something given freely into a moment that demanded response. Daniel didn't want gratitude to feel like a spotlight, so he chose quiet. In the kitchen, he filled the kettle and waited, listening to the low hiss of water warming. He remembered how Aisha made her tea. Loose leaves, no rush. He found her favorite cup, the plain white one, with the small chip near the handle, imperfect and familiar. He set the cup on the counter, placed the book beside it, and let the steam rise slowly, carrying something herbal and grounding into the air. He searched for the right words, then stopped himself. 3 would be enough. He wrote them carefully on a small scrap of paper for the next quiet afternoon. Nothing more, nothing that asked for acknowledgement. He slid the note under the saucer, so just the corner showed a signal rather than a declaration. Then he turned off the light and walked away, his chest tight with something close to hope. Morning came softly. Daniel descended the stairs with a strange mix of anticipation and doubt. The counter was clean. The cup washed and drying. The book gone. No note, no sign. For a moment, uncertainty crept in, had he imagined the depth of it all. Then he saw the windowsill. A small green pot sat in the sunlight, rosemary reaching upward, alive and fragrant. Beneath it, the same scrap of paper flipped over. 2 words added in careful, elegant handwriting. "Thank you." Daniel didn't touch it. He let the light fall where it did. The conversation had been answered not with explanations, but with understanding, and somehow that was everything. In the quiet hours that followed, Daniel found another message waiting for him, one that spoke without asking to be answered. He was passing the living room bookshelf when something felt different. The dark book of poems had been returned to its place, spine-aligned, just as before. But beside it, nestled with deliberate care, were a few of the children's picture books, the simple ones with wide margins, a handful of words, colors, bold and honest. They hadn't been stacked by accident. They stood together equal, as if keeping each other company. Daniel stopped. He understood then. This wasn't a thank you alone. It was an opening. Aisha hadn't hidden her world away after being seen. She hadn't closed ranks or retreated into formality. Instead, she had widened the circle, quietly, generously placing her poetry beside his children's first words, as if to say, "This belongs here. We can share this space." Emotion rose in his throat, unexpected and steady. He ran his finger along the edge of a picture book, remembering how he'd rushed through bedtime stories, how often he'd treated reading as a task to complete rather than a place to linger. The invitation felt tender and brave. She was trusting him not to rush it, not to turn it into something performative or praised into stiffness. That evening, Daniel took one of the picture books upstairs. He sat on the floor between the twins' beds, the lamp casting a soft pool of light. He read slowly, painfully slowly, at first, letting the pauses stretch. He asked questions he didn't know the answers to. He listened. One child drifted off mid-page, the other stayed eyes wide, breathing steady until the end. When Daniel closed the book, he felt different. Not accomplished, not redeemed, just present. In the kitchen afterward, Aisha caught his eye. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply met his gaze with a quiet understanding that felt like permission. The circle had widened again, and for the first time, Daniel sensed that the peace he'd witnessed wasn't fragile at all. It was patient, waiting to be joined. Something quietly irreversible began that week. Daniel didn't announce it. He didn't make promises to himself or declarations to anyone else. He simply started showing up differently. Earlier when he could. Slower even when he couldn't. He learned that presence wasn't about grand gestures. It was about choosing not to disappear into exhaustion the moment he crossed the threshold of his own home. In the evenings, instead of hovering on the edge of the room while the television hummed, he sat on the floor. He helped with baths and didn't rush the splashing. He listened to stories that wandered nowhere and everywhere at once. When bedtime came, he reached for a book before the remote. Sometimes the children fell asleep halfway through a page. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, he stayed until the breathing in the room evened out. He began to notice how calm was made, not demanded. Aisha never instructed him. She never corrected or praised. She simply made space. In the backyard, she sat on the grass while the twins watered the rosemary plant carefully at its roots, explaining in her soft voice why leaves didn't drink the way people thought they did. Daniel found himself kneeling beside them, dirt staining his work pants, asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. At first, he felt like an intruder in a language he didn't speak. Then slowly, without ceremony, he learned the rhythm. The hum she used while tying shoes, the pause before responding to a tantrum, the way she turned chaos sideways instead of pushing against it. One afternoon, the children were wild with leftover energy bouncing off walls and nerves alike. Daniel felt the old reflex rise. Just put something on. Instead, Aisha sat at the table with her poetry book, a blank sketch pad, and crayons. She began to read. Not loudly, not invitingly, just steadily. The children drifted in one by one. Daniel stayed standing unsure until she slid a crayon toward him without looking. He hesitated, then sat. He drew nothing recognizable, just lines, color, presence. That was when he understood. Aisha hadn't only been caring for his children. She had been teaching him patiently, quietly how to stay. The house began to change, not in ways you could list, but in ways you could feel. It wasn't just clean anymore, it was cared for. One afternoon, Daniel and his wife returned from a long, noisy outing, the kind that left children sticky and half asleep, laughter thinning into yawns. As Daniel carried their youngest inside, he noticed the windows thrown open, wide curtains breathing with the spring air. A scent of lemon and mint lingered fresh and alive. And then there was the sound, soft, wandering, unmistakably human. Music, not from a speaker, not polished. A single wooden flute filled the living room with a melody that felt both light and aching, as if it had learned how to be gentle by knowing sorrow first. Aisha sat on the sofa, eyes closed, playing not for anyone, but with the quiet itself. A cup of tea steamed beside her. The house listened. She lowered the flute when she saw them. No embarrassment, no explanation. Just a calm presence that seemed to say this too belonged here. Daniel stood still, understanding something at last. What they paid her each week wasn't a transaction. It was an exchange. They offered space and trust. She returned something far rarer, a steady hand on the pulse of their home. She tended not just floors and dishes, but atmosphere, mood. The invisible threads that made returning feel like arriving. "Thank you," Daniel said, and meant far more than the words could hold. He meant the music lingering in corners, the peace in his children's faces, the way the house no longer braced itself when the day ended. Later that night, after the children slept, Daniel walked through the rooms slowly, toys put away with care, books aligned, light resting where it should. The home felt held. He realized then that a house doesn't find its soul on its own. Someone has to listen long enough to hear it breathe and love it quietly into being. A year passed without ceremony. No single moment marked the change, no dramatic speech. Just a quiet accumulation of afternoons, some loud with laughter, some messy, some tired, some barely quiet at all. But all of them intentional. One evening, as dusk settled into the backyard, Daniel sat beside his wife on the wooden steps. The children chased fireflies, their small hands glowing briefly, before opening again, releasing the light back into the dark. Aisha sat a little distance away, watching the sky as if it were speaking softly to her. Daniel's wife leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you remember," she said almost casually, "how heavy this house used to feel?" He nodded. He remembered the constant tension, the sense of managing rather than living, of surviving evenings instead of entering them. Work was still hard. Bills still arrived. The children still had tantrums and fevers and bad days. Nothing external had magically fixed itself. But the house no longer felt like a place you collapsed into. It felt like a place that caught you. Daniel watched Aisha help their youngest gently open her hands, letting a firefly lift into the night. No grabbing, no rushing. Just wonder, then release. And suddenly he understood what she had been teaching them all along. Not solutions, not control, not perfection, but how to hold a moment gently, how to notice the light, and how to let go without fear, trusting that another moment would come. The story hadn't ended with him catching someone doing something wrong. It had ended with him being caught by goodness, by patience, by a quieter kind of love that doesn't announce itself, and that he realized was more than enough. True peace isn't built by fixing everything. It's built by slowing down enough to be present inside what already exists. We often look for big changes, loud solutions, dramatic turning points. But the most powerful transformations happen quietly in how we listen, how we sit with others, how we choose presence over escape. Sometimes the greatest gift in your life isn't someone who solves your problems, but someone who teaches you how to stay. What quiet moment in your life changed you without you realizing it at first? Share your story. In the comments I read, everyone. If this story touched you, like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. We tell stories for people who believe that small moments can change entire lives.